For the better part of nearly 40 years, Sting was one of pro wrestling's pre-eminent protagonists, enjoying prominent runs in WCW, TNA, and AEW. But all good things must come to an end, and for 2024, the Icon announced that he would hang up his boots and bat at AEW Revolution in Greensboro, bringing an end to his storied, championship-filled career. And in that storied, championship-filled career, Sting held world titles on 14 occasions, making him one of the industry's most decorated headliners. As such, his collection of top championships had to begin somewhere, and that somewhere was Baltimore, Maryland on Saturday, July 7th, 1990. More than 2 years after being earmarked as an undoubted future flag bearer, Sting became an organization's top singles champion for the first time ever. But like all stories of success, the road to triumph wasn't so smoothly paved. I'm Jack from Cultaholic Wrestling, and this is the true story of Sting's first world title win. On March 27th, 1988, the general main event scene of contemporary professional wrestling changed forever. In the WWF, the increasingly popular Macho Man Randy Savage won his first recognized world title, capturing the vacant belt by defeating Ted DiBiase in a tournament final at WrestleMania 4 in Atlantic City. Meanwhile, on the same date, in the overgrown territory known as Jim Crockett Promotions, a new main event star in their own right emerged. After having 2 pay-per-view efforts railroaded by spiteful WWF counter-programming, Crockett decided, hey, turnabout is fair play. And so, on March 27th, he staged the first ever Clash of the Champions on TBS, offering a free supercard to counter WWF's premium broadcast. When it came to assembling the Clash card, Booker Dusty Rhodes was in something of a precarious spot. He needed to book someone that could credibly challenge NWA World Champion Ric Flair for the £10 of gold. But he also couldn't give away a supercard caliber match for free, since house show business was largely the territory's bread and butter. For the role of Flair's challenger, Dusty went with a still ascending up-and-comer, one that some figured was due for an eventual breakthrough. His name was Steve Borden, and he'd been in the wrestling business for under 3 years, cutting his teeth as part of a training class that included Jim Hellwig, the future Ultimate Warrior. In the time that followed, the man called Sting went from green as grass bodybuilder to promising talent with a billboard-worthy look. And this was after really leveling up his game working for Bill Watts in the UWF. Behind the scenes, it was one Watts regular, Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert, that openly touted the prospect of Sting. The breakout began in the summer of '87 when Sting turned babyface, betraying his villainous brethren to side with Chris Adams and earning a loudly favourable response for doing so. The muscle-bound youngster had an obvious magnetism, a physical charisma that didn't manifest itself in pointed promos, but rather in his sheer presence. Sting just had it, his intangible gifts augmented by the right physical presentation. In '87, Crockett bought out Watts' UWF promotion, where Sting was the reigning tag team champion alongside Rick Steiner. Over the months ahead, Crockett's group squandered a lot of the incoming talent from Watts' promotion, booking them into oblivion against the Crockett home team. Sting wasn't buried, but he didn't immediately have the rocket strapped to his back either. He worked a 6-man opener at the 1987 Starrcade, and once we got to 1988, was relegated to a dark match at Bunkhouse Stampede. On camera, Sting may have been a moderately pushed babyface, but off-screen, there were certainly designs on testing him at the top level. On house shows beginning in late '87, Sting worked NWA World title bouts with Ric Flair. Come March 27th, before 6,000 fans at the Greensboro Coliseum, Flair vs Sting went on last of the 5 televised bouts. The two would really have their work cut out for them trying to follow a fast-paced Midnight Express match with the Fantastics and Lex Luger and Barry Windham's jubilant World Tag Team title win over Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard. Oh, and Sting and Flair were tasked with going 45 minutes. Now, this was mere child's play for the 60-minute man Ric Flair, but for Sting, this would be the most daunting challenge of his career so far. While Flair was regarded as the ideal ring general, Sting would more than hold up his end of the bargain. With Flair providing the instructions, Sting answered every single one with aplomb, looking every bit the worthy challenger to Flair's throne. In the final stage, Sting trapped Flair in the Scorpion Deathlock, but the bell sounded as Rick was fighting against the current, signaling a time limit draw after 45 long minutes. The match was an instant classic, one that Dave Meltzer rated 4 3/4 stars, and many fans and critics came to a similar conclusion, that Sting was one half of a TV masterpiece. Flair later went on to write of that historic encounter encounter, I could feel the mood of the people and knew that they were buying Sting as my peer. So was I. Sting had the ability and loved wrestling so much that I knew he was going to make it. Now, Sting remained high in the Crockett mix throughout the rest of 1988, teaming with prominent babyfaces like Dusty Rhodes and Nikita Koloff, while challenging for secondary championships. With a sustained push, Sting's popularity continued to soar. So much so that when Dusty was faced with the difficult task of turning the uber-popular Road Warriors heel, he had them turn on Sting, believing that the Warriors would likely be cheered were they to attack any other babyface. In 1989, in what was now Ted Turner's WCW, Sting finally struck gold, winning the TV title from Mike Rotunda. He spent the next few months defending the belt against an emerging rival in the Great Muta, battling his face-painted counterpart in excellent matches over the summer of '89. By this time, still world champion Flair had now turned babyface, aligning with Sting against Muta, Terry Funk, and the rest of Gary Hart's J-Tex Corporation. The two partnered up at October's Halloween Havoc to beat Funk and Muta in a Thunderdome steel cage match, giving Sting his first ever win in a pay-per-view main event. The 1989 Starrcade had quite a weird format, staging singles and tag round-robin tournaments in one night to determine supremacy in the respective divisions. The singles final came down to Sting versus Flair for the spoils. Now, based on the point system, Sting needed a pinfall or submission victory over the Nature Boy to win the tournament. Though the NWA World title was not on the line, Sting still scored his biggest career win to date by countering Flair's figure 4 attempt with an inside cradle, pinning his fellow babyface in dramatic fashion. Notably, days before Starrcade, the Four Horsemen reformed in WCW as a babyface faction, albeit with only 3 members. Shortly after 1990 began, the Horsemen named their 4th member, Sting himself. Just as notably, by virtue of pinning Flair to win the Starrcade round robin, Sting had earned a world title match with Flair at February's Wrestle War pay-per-view. On February 6, 1990, on a Clash of the Champions broadcast taking place 3 weeks before Wrestle War, Sting was kicked out of the Horsemen. After his supposed new friends ordered him to forfeit his impending title match, Sting refused and was beaten down by Flair and the Andersons as a result. Not only was the angle a strong piece of business, but the choice of pay-per-view venue was perfect. Wrestle War would take place at the same Greensboro Coliseum where Sting took Flair to the limit 2 years earlier, commencing his path to superstardom. For a business that leans very heavily on symbolism, Sting winning the belt in Greensboro looked as certain as the sun rising. The double cross angle looked to continue at the end of Clash of the Champions when Sting intruded upon the main event, a cage match featuring his now former Horseman allies. And that's where everything went wrong. During the course of the wild melee, Sting blew out his knee, tearing his ACL. In an instant, the world title match for Wrestle War was off the table. Sting was going to miss several months of action, leaving a gaping hole in the main event picture. With Sting sidelined, Lex Luger was slotted in as Flair's challenger for Wrestle War. In a haste to make up for the loss of his top star, WCW EVP Jim Herd wanted to put Luger over at the pay-per-view, but Rick refused, feeling that it would be utterly wasteful to change horses midstream. Come hell or high water, Flair said he was holding the title until Sting was ready, because that was the original plan. And Flair did retain the belt, outlasting Luger in a 38-minute battle, with a crutch-bound Sting looking on. Flair retained the title once more over Luger at May's Capital Combat event, losing via DQ inside a steel cage. Incredibly, this wasn't even the stupidest part of Capital Combat. That indignity goes to Sting being rescued from a Horseman ambush by none other than RoboCop. Fortunately, some indignities passed quickly enough, and by the early summer, Sting was ready to return to action. By June, it was official. Sting would return at the Great American Bash at the Baltimore Arena on July 7th to challenge Flair for the NWA World title. The match would represent a major changing of the guard. Since September '81, men not named Ric Flair had only held the NWA World title for a combined 337 days, less than 1 year in total. Flair's 6 recognized reigns with the belt, to that point, totaled in excess of 2,800 days, more than 7.5 combined years. Flair was the man of the 80s, but now was 41 years of age. Sting, 10 years younger, was poised to rule the 90s, the new leading man of the changing frontier. And Sting really looked the part of superhero conqueror as well, arriving at the Great American Bash in appropriate star-spangled attire and war paint. So iconic was this look that Sting obliged a request to wear the getup at a StarCast convention decades later, which appropriately also took place in Baltimore. Not only would Sting have the Charm City crowd on his side, but the match's setup seemingly neutralized all of Flair's outs. Ringside would be surrounded by a handful of babyfaces, including the Steiner brothers, to prevent any interference from the Horsemen. Meanwhile, the Horsemen's puppet master, Ole Anderson, would be handcuffed on the entrance stage to the recently arrived El Gigante. So after lots of screwiness from Flair's stable in previous title matches, finally, the playing field was level. Sting and Flair's title bout began with the usual gusto, two fired-up pros at the very top of their game. Flair tried to work over Sting's once injured knee, but could never get a sustained blitz on the limb. Meanwhile, Sting shook off portions of Flair's offense to establish his seeming invincibility. These tropes would repeat themselves as the drama and the tension continued to build. Not quite 15 minutes in, Sting commenced his finishing sequence, hitting the Stinger Splash and trapping Flair in the Scorpion Deathlock. The Horsemen all tried to rush the ring, only for Sting's allies to hold them at bay. However, Flair, after fighting the hold for a prolonged spell, managed to get to the bottom rope. Then, when Flair tried for a cheap pinfall with his feet on the ropes, Scott Steiner was there to shove them away. An exchange of near falls ensued, with Jim Ross's excited commentary equaling the fervor of the fans in attendance in Baltimore. Sting then tried for a cross-corner charge, but Flair moved, causing the challenger to hit his repaired knee against the turnbuckle. Sensing his opportunity, Flair went for the figure four, only for Sting, in a similar way to their Starrcade battle, to cradle him for the pin and the championship beneath a hail of pyro and the cheers from the crowd. At 31 years of age, less than 5 years into his wrestling career, Sting was the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion, and did so by dethroning one of the industry's premier icons in grand fashion. This scene rates as one of WCW's all-time greatest moments, and almost inarguably the most positively memorable moment of the pre-Monday Night Wars era of WCW. Since that day, Sting accumulated 13 more world titles, some of them on pay-per-view, some on TV, some even at house shows. One of them should have been his ultimate crowning moment, but the poor execution rendered it as best left forgotten, talking of course about Starrcade 97. None of those title wins, though, produced the same spark, invoked the same simple joy as Sting's first. Many of the fans that rejoiced in Sting's victory were there for much of his ascent through the wrestling business in those few short years. Because of this organic connection, Sting's championship coronation was especially satisfying to those that had backed him throughout this journey. And yet, wrestling history as we know it would have been very different if Flair had dropped the belt to Luger or anybody else when Sting was out injured. Flair being the near-eternal champion and picking up a few more tainted wins along the way only made Sting's eventual triumph sweeter. In a near 40-year career filled with legendary moments and warm memories, Sting never looked more the part of world champion than on that day in July of 1990. As Steve Borden closes the book on his iconic career in 2024, it's important to remember the match, the moment in which Sting truly cemented himself as the icon.